think now we're almost made up for the initial technical problems, and I'll try to move through this one briskly. And please remind me when it's going to be time for the next official break. I appreciate that. It keeps me on track. Just as institutions rise and fall, right? Where I described a rise and a fall, but a rise and fall in functionality. Many non-functional institutions, or honestly dysfunctional institutions, can persist for centuries after their purpose has been long superseded. I actually think that when we think of these institutions coming into functionality and falling out of functionality, and then successful or less successful imitations of functional institutions. Okay, cool. We have to imagine these as essentially subsidizing the non-functional institutions in the rest of society, right? There has to be a SpaceX to tax or to fund. You know, there has to be a government that sort of collects taxes. Even if society is mostly a Ponzi scheme, even if you have a very extractive view of society, perhaps an almost classically Marxist view where there are productive forces and then there are, forces that are parasitical on the productive forces of society. Even in that view, you kind of have to have a theory of the origin of value, the origin of wealth, of production of knowledge. And my ontology and my general view of history derived from great founder theory, which is this institutionalist view with, of course, a theory of the origin of institutions, is that a small number of functional institutions in a society subsidize all the rest. These subsidies could be in the form of literal subsidies, right? Literal taxation, for example, or they could be human capital, or they could be well-maintained commons, and so on. Civilizations might then rise and fall on basically the proportion of these functional institutions versus non-functional ones. And civilizations might rise and fall on the basis of introduction of new social technologies or the loss and the forgetting and the dysfunctionality of old social technologies, right? The sort of cycles of institutional renewal that I described are hardly a new observation. If we lean again on sort of the Greek perspective, it would be the concept of the kyklos, right? In antiquity, the view tended to be that the form of government rotates between, democracy, oligarchy, dictatorship or monarchy, and that all city-states go through a predictable cycle of institutional change and political change, deterministic. I don't think we can quite know if that is the case with those states. Like I said, we lost the data set. Maybe one day we'll rediscover more of the data set, but for now it's lost. But the basic idea of civilizational rise and fall has been a very old one. There is, of course, the views of the golden, silver, bronze, and iron age, of sort of a declinist view where the golden age is always in the infinitely distant past and there's just decay. And then the opposite, and that's of course I think a myth, right? I don't think we see persistent decay. But if a society is adaptive, live, is reinventing itself all the time, it weathers the climactic shocks well. The analogy here I would make is that of a forest, right? A healthy forest isn't wiped out by a forest fire, not because there are no forest fires, right? There are always small sparks, there's always lightning, sometimes arson. It's because there's not that much dead tree material around, right? There hasn't been a buildup of a background risk. Occasional fires burn small parts of the forest regrows. I think with static societies, they can endure for centuries, not because they're sound, but because their circumstances are favorable. And then when a change comes, the society does not change with that. So when the Vikings, the Norsemen who settled Greenland, experienced climactic change, rather than copy the technology of the Inuits, they chose to emigrate or, presumably to wither away rather than persist in Greenland. It was more desirable for them to, say, go back to Iceland or Norway or persist in their social forms than to change. And that was the end of Norse settlement in Greenland. Living society, I think, adapts to climate shocks fairly well. A stagnant one that doesn't have many founders, that doesn't have many new functional institutions, adapts poorly. The first sort of question is, let's now think a little bit. I started almost by talking about the fall, but let's talk about the rise of societies. I think that it's hard to deny that there are some historical events that just seem very unlikely. Say, sort of the creation of the Roman Empire is perhaps such an event. It's rather unusual and unexpected that the Mediterranean should have been unified and conquered by a single city-state, and a barbarian city-state at that. It wasn't even Greek, right? It was Latin-speaking, sort of imitative of Etruscan and Greek culture, arguably Etruscan and Greek culture, which were much more prominent than Latin culture for most of the history of the peninsula, the Italian peninsula. You would have expected perhaps that if, because of geopolitical factors, the unity of the Mediterranean was a given conclusion, and I'm actually not sure it is, right? Notably, no one else since the Roman Empire has unified the Mediterranean. Many times there was a unity in the Eastern Mediterranean, a few times in the Western Mediterranean. I could give two examples. I think that there was relative unity in the Eastern Mediterranean during, let's say, Venetian and Ottoman naval dominance, and there was relative unity in the Western Mediterranean even before the Roman conquests, where the Carthaginians were the dominant naval power. But it's actually been very rare for their entire Mediterranean to be unified with a single naval or land power. Still, if because of geopolitics, because of the influence of geography, that unity was inevitable, I think most people would have bet on, maybe the Persian Empire expands, maybe there's a Greek kingdom like that of Alexander the Great. I don't think many people would have bet on a city-state. A city-state, after all, is not a form of society, government, economics that scales very well. The Roman Empire was immensely innovative in that it figured out how a city-state could govern an empire. Alexander's empire, Alexander the Great, as influential as it was, of course copying very much from the Persians that he defeated, was not a system where there was a city-state attached to an empire. It was a royal family attached to an empire. I think this unique sort of innovation of the Roman system can only be described as the sort of incremental introduction of new social technologies that were crafted over and over again through many reforms, through many changing circumstances, over centuries, until something fundamentally new and different came into being. So I would say that when we speak of Greco-Roman civilization, perhaps that is a fundamental misnomer, because what's unique about Rome doesn't seem to be really a feature of Greek civilization, right? Greek civilization was just as easily absorbed by the Persians as it was by the Romans. So I think that if we take a broader perspective, as deeply influential as the Greek world was, I don't think it's fully captured in the Roman branch. I think the Persian and, less well known, even the Indian branch can just as successful, just as credibly claim to be, descendants of that civilization. For example, the earliest statues of the Buddha that we ever see are probably done by Greek craftsmen. The Indo-Greek kingdoms that exist in India after Alexander the Great's conquest were actually centers of artistic and probably philosophical innovation. And we know of at least a few examples of mathematicians moving out of Alexandria as Alexandria fails into India. And I'm sure there are many cases of Indian scholars and so on moving west into Alexandria. So Greek civilization deeply influences many others. The identification of Rome and Greece, I think, is more questionable, precisely because of these deep innovations on the social form of the city-state. So when I talk about empire, I have this, there's obviously empire in this classical political sense, but there's also a little bit of a playful definition that I have in some of my writing where I apply empire as a metaphor to smaller spaces of human organization. And then I propose that it's just a group of coordinated actors that operate around some central power. These, players can be institutional or individual. The reason I find this useful is because I think the dynamics of power follow a very predictable track, a very fractal track. It almost doesn't matter if you look at the office politics of Amazon, the politics of a nation, the politics of an empire, the politics of an organized corporate body. You can usually identify some sort of central power keeping the system together. You can these I term high. Then you have centers of power that are strong enough to challenge the center. These I can term mid. And then there are even smaller fragments of power that I think can challenge middle powers. These I would call low. And to sort of describe these power dynamics a little bit, I would say that, in a company, the central power might be the CEO or the executive team. In a state, it might be any of the branches of government. You can even, if you were being playful, analyze a single individual's center of power. Because at the end of the day, if you think of someone like Elon Musk, it kind of doesn't make sense to analyze SpaceX and Tesla as completely separate companies. It actually makes very little sense to do that. Not only do they have a joint CEO, but bizarrely, I think they have a shared PR strategy. If there was a massive scandal or issue with Tesla cars, I guarantee you this would impact the credibility of SpaceX. So do we even have a term for this type of economic conglomerate? Like, their power structure is supposed to be different, their economic structure is supposed to be different, but obviously if you look at this as a sociologist, they're a shared system. There are effects going through the system both ways. And that's why I introduced this terminology of empire applied not just to states, but to these smaller sub-entities. I'm not going to go into the details of all of these theories of power too much. I just wanted to lay the ground so that I could explain a typology that I believe is fairly good at describing the rise and fall of societies as a whole. Societies, again, I think are best thought of as these dense, interconnected ecosystems of institutions, functional and non-functional, and various players such as, Crassus or Elon Musk or Alexander the Great or whatever, what have you, individuals that accrue insight and power and go ahead and terraform these societies by creating new institutions or demolishing old ones. The 2x2 typology that I would propose here would be one of expanding empires and declining empires, and then two architectures that I think work fairly well, the decentralized and the centralized one, where they have different failure modes. To talk through it, the centralized expanding empire is perhaps the simplest type, both in terms of political economy, but also in terms of analysis. In this setup, the center of society, high, the center of the power landscape, right? Because the power landscape isn't quite the same as the rest of society. You can obviously have a center of power that's not a center of learning, or a center of power that's not a center of population. The center is the source of a giant flow of resources that are distributed downwards in a pyramid-like structure. That's why the society or the structure can be so centralized. If high controls the flow of resources, it distributes these resources to mid, securing the support of mid powers, and these then in turn distributed further to low. This results in a pretty unified structure that, however, has an extremely difficult time dealing with diverse challenges. It will knock out particular challenges very well if, led by a functional institutional core. The reason why I mentioned both Napoleon and Alexander the Great earlier in my presentations is because in a political dimension, they are probably one of the best examples of this, right? If you're Alexander the Great, what is the most important reason you keep on marching? Well, of course, there's the romantic reason. You kind of want to see the world. You want to talk to Diogenes. You want to water your horse in the Indus River. You want to see these mystical places. There's a fun argument that, perhaps if Alexander the Great was born today, he'd just be a world traveler. He wouldn't bother with the military. It's just that in 200, 300, 400 BC, you kind of need a military to travel around the world. It's possible for a human, of course, to walk from Spain to Korea in just a few years. But if you try to do that in the Neolithic, you would be killed long before you reached your destination, probably by other people. So the greatest challenge for travel for most of human history were not the oceans, were not the deserts, were not the mountains. It was the tribe one mountain over, one ocean over, one sea over, right? You would need some way to navigate them, navigate the human terrain, not just the material terrain. So still, he had a political reason, not just a wanderlust, to engage in these conquests. The political reason is his father, Philip II, left him with a large standing professional military and, let's say, a solid economic basis. But the reason standing militaries are avoided for most of human history, it's a little bit different today, is that a standing military, if you fail to pay it, might decide that it wants a different paymaster. In other words, it is a tool, but it is also a political player. A strong, competent military might overthrow you if you are unable to provide it the resources it needs. In other words, in the pyramid structure I described earlier, mid grows discoordinated and rebellious if high cannot provide the flow of resources down a classical patronate structure. And the military, more than most other forms of organization, is the one most capable of overturning political orders. Say a court system could do similar things, but it's much slower, it's much more incremental, it's sort of much messier and contested than, say, a coup is, right? So as soon as you embark on the conquest of Persia, you actually can't stop. You're not paying your soldiers out of a budget. Yeah, sure, it's subsidized by your state budget, but actually you're paying them in war loot. So every time you beat a Persian army, or you have even part of the Persian forces defect to you, or when you raise additional troops, you kind of have to you have to keep going. You have to conquer again and again and again just to pay the troops you've already committed to. There's a dark undertone to this, which is that I think, and this is stated in Chinese sources, for example, from the Warring States period, I think sometimes wars are fought in order to destroy your own military. Because what is cheaper? To take your veterans onto one more fight, or to actually give them the land and the funding so that they live a decent life that feels worth 10 or 20 years of intense suffering on behalf of your country? I think it's very difficult to treat your veterans well. And that's actually one of the biggest drivers of political history. And that's actually probably one of the drivers of Roman expansion, though I'm going to talk about Rome later because I think it's a different expanding empire and society typology. So the centralized expanding empire has a notable failure mode, which is the centralized declining empire. Once you have conquered the world, what else remains to be conquered? Once you have industrialized fully and developed your centers, where will economic growth come from? Once you've converted everyone in a region to your religion, well, where do new tithes come from, for example? You have a pyramid scheme, a literal pyramid scheme, right? In the sense that you always have to get, once you've bought into it, you kind of need to get 3 or 4 other people to buy into it for you to have a profit, or you're the one stuck with a loss. There's a political pyramid scheme in all empires and all civilizations, where they are in fact predicated on growth. And as soon as the growth stops, the coordination that was bought by the central flow of resources breaks down, and it starts cannibalizing itself. The centralized declining empire is perhaps the most stable, slow declining form. In this form, if you're, say, the Emperor of China or, the Roman Senate, you might choose to starve systematically and sometimes literally mid-centers of power. You realize there's no way we can continue to provide the kind of growth we have, the kind of growth in manpower, the kind of growth in wealth. Possibly, you could argue that there's such a thing as scientific growth, right, where learning new things about the world and new forms of innovation make your existing holdings more productive. Once you realize you can't do that, you either wait for the mid-powers to rebel against you, or you start to parasitize the mid-powers. You tax them out of existence. And then if you do that, if you smash them, if you declare them traitors, if you eliminate them, sometimes physically, right? If the Senate calls for the arrest of a general that is popular with the troops and executes that general, they have perhaps committed a great disservice to their country, but have done themselves a great political service in remaining in power, right? The Roman Senate, if it does not arrest and execute that general, might find itself overthrown. So when you can no longer pay them off, you have to start eliminating mid-powers. And for a while, this can work. But the problem is the mid-powers are often playing important roles for your society. Remember, the centralized expanding empire archetype has this problem of local focus where you can only direct your attention and your efforts to a limited number of domains. In practice, you are delegating most functions in society to other power centers. If in order to maintain your political power, you have to destroy those centers of society, well, then you're destroying social functions. Your civilization as a whole will work less and less and less well. And I think we can see this in the decadent phases of Chinese dynasties, right? If you think of something like the late Ming era, for example, I think is quite like this. I think there are many periods of late Roman history when it's no longer a republic but a classic empire. I think you have many periods in late Roman history where, say, successful generals that are beating the barbarians are killed because they're political rivals, right? If you are in the Byzantine Empire, if you're in the Roman Empire, it might not pay to be Belisarius. It might not pay to be, Honorius or someone like this, because every victory you have over the barbarians demonstrates you are a political threat to your emperor. And, how much time do you have? How much time do you have before the emperor decides you are a greater threat than the Vandals, right? You're on a ticker. You have a runway. Perhaps you're a startup emperor yourself. Perhaps realizing that you have become too successful, you have no choice but to take your army and go march on the capital and try hope against hope that you're there and that you can overthrow this emperor. It doesn't matter if you want it to be loyal or not. Actually, the best way to think of it is imagine a world where GDP was shrinking every year by 1% for 200 years. Every single year might feel to you as an individual living in such a society as basically the same as last year. Perhaps you personally would even do slightly better than you did last year, even if the rest of society is doing worse. However, after 200 years of compound interest, right? There's a giant debt that's happening. There's a sort of withering away of society. You would have a world with a vastly lower population, more primitive economics, less material wealth, less technology. And this is in fact what we see. The Roman Empire of the 4th century AD is not comparable to the Roman Empire of the 1st century AD. So the benefit of this, let's say, is that in the centralized declining empire type of civilizational decline, I think we very much do see kind of like a controlled implosion, which leaves the possibility of revival or refounding. were a new source of growth to open up, to be seen, to be discovered, to be brought in, you can reverse this trend. It's a lot of work, where after you've had, let's say, a few centuries of institutional betrayal, where the game is only, to not be the first one overboard on a sinking ship, it can take a lot to reform a culture that has become predatory and extractive and oriented, again, away from negative or zero-sum games in terms of game theory into positive ones. I think it can take a lot of work. I think we can often also think of this as transitions between high-trust societies and low-trust societies, where I think it's incorrect to think that societies started off as, Hobbesian, and now today we operate with a high degree of trust and mutual cooperation. I think societies have moved up and down in terms of justified social trust on the basis of the actual circumstances that pervade in society. Arguably, when you look at the Western world today, and of course, I'm perhaps a little biased, I think in the United States you're seeing a transition from a high-trust society to a low-trust society. And then in China, ironically, I think you're seeing a transition from a low-trust society to a high-trust society. Things like the social credit score system, I have quibbles with it, but it does show to an important truth. The Chinese Communist Party is taking very heavy-handed approaches to try to reshape Chinese society. But very heavy-handed approaches were used to transform Western societies a few centuries ago. In 16th century England, the second most common cause of mortality among men, adult men, after disease was execution. That's quite heavy-handed, right? Like, that's not that long ago, that's a few hundred years ago. But that perhaps heavy-handed approach did help in reforming English society from a very violent, chaotic one to today, if anything, known for excessive civility. Other examples of this might be the transformation of Scandinavian culture from a culture that was boastful to a fault, right? If you read medieval Nordic sagas, they sound like hip-hop music. People are bragging about gold and how many enemies they killed and how many concubines they captured and so on, right? How daring their raids were, to the point where in modern Scandinavian culture, any sort of bragging is considered almost like, it's taboo, it backfires, it doesn't work, you're supposed to conform to the same rules as everyone, you're never supposed to claim that you're someone special or that you know better than others. And this has positive and negative sides, but truly what I'm trying to show here is this almost 180-degree turn in the culture of a society. I think one of the things that's often neglected is we think of societies as archetypes, but I guarantee you, if you could talk to, say, a Roman in the 1st century BC and a Roman in the 2nd century BC, these would seem like people from very different societies, though they would both claim that they're the same society because they have the same forms. Cultures change under the surface massively. I think one of the reasons that 18th century Europeans had a very high opinion of the Confucian bureaucracy of China and the Chinese education system. Meanwhile, 19th century Europeans had a very low opinion. All of these outdated stereotypes that, the Chinese their education system only does rote learning and so on. It doesn't have any genuine understanding. It's excessively rigid and bureaucratic. These were stereotypes and impressions that were formed in the 19th century. Meanwhile, in the 18th century, French philosophers would look to the Chinese system as the obviously enlightened one, the one where the most humanistic education and the values of the Enlightenment are actually embodied far better than in European civilization. Part of the reason for this change in perspective is not just a change in Europe, but a change in China. 18th century China's bureaucracy and civil service and education system, according to their sources, worked vastly better than the 19th century one. So, Europeans encountered a China that was already in decline on its own terms. Had they encountered a rising China, I think Western stereotypes about China and perceptions would have been quite different. So this profound change can happen even within a culture as it, say, shifts between these modes of centralized expanding to declining empire. And the changes trickle down through so much of society, from high and mid mostly, Sometimes there is innovation, though, in low and mid that is not centrally directed. And that brings me to the decentralized models. For examples of decentralized expanding empires, I think the Roman Empire in the era of the Republic, so the Roman Republic's conquest of the Mediterranean, and the British Empire of the 18th and 19th century are fairly good examples. If you are an 18th or 17th century adventurer who wants to make a name for themselves, going and conquering some random part of the world or engaging in profitable trade there was a better route to advancement than going to London. You would actually go out into the world and then return to London with your winnings. Similarly, in ancient Rome, the best way to dominate political offices in Rome was to run successful operations and conquests. To conquer Rome, Julius Caesar had to first conquer Gaul. Going to Gaul gave him popularity. It allowed him to bond and acquire the loyalty of his troops. And also, because the economics of ancient warfare are different than the economics of modern warfare, it was also a very profitable undertaking. It was underwritten by Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, but these loans could be repaid from the profits of the conquest of Gaul. And then, how do you get a reason to attack Gaul? Well, you have to argue that on the basis of existing treaties, the Romans should protect their Celtic allies in Gaul from German invaders, Germanic invaders. So he's not even allowed to go conquer territories on his own. The Roman Senate doesn't want generals deciding on their own that they need to conquer random parts of the world and raise massive militaries and enjoy massive profits and boosts to popularity. The Senate actually wants to limit that as much as it can. It just fails to. So the power center of society might be mildly parasitical, or a mix of parasitical and productive, and it's mostly just taxing middle powers, be they generals, be they cities, be they religious orders, be they regions, be they tribes, that are actually growing and would eventually outgrow the power center of society and even replace it, were it not for that stable setup of taxation. And you can have a system like this that operates for centuries, where it's not London, but it's the Sir Francis Drakes of the world that are determining which random corner of the world is the British Empire going to dominate next. It almost is like a form of entrepreneurship, like piracy under taxation. And it's not the Roman Senate, but the local ambitious generals and politicians who are each trying to make them a name for themselves back in Rome that determine what Rome's next war is going to be. Sure, the Senate still determines various wars, but they're often driven by the machinations of people like Julius Caesar or Crassus or Pompey. So the decentralized expanding empire has the advantage that it can deal with multiple problems in multiple parts of the world. Multiple dimensions can be focused on. It has more live players. Its disadvantage compared to a centralized expanding empire is a tendency for civil war, which happens whenever the center becomes too weak relative to middle powers. The most dangerous situation is when you have 2 or 3 factions or power centers that are about equally balanced. This can still be immensely productive, but it can be immensely destructive. There's an interpretation of European history that is common in the historiography, which is that the separation of church and state, which was a side effect of the separation of imperial power in the Holy Roman Empire from the power of the papacy, was key to the dynamism of Europe. This might be true, right? Something like the Hansa, right? The trade league of North German cities, or the city-states of Italy might never have emerged where the emperor and the pope basically unified in a single center of power. They might have eliminated all of these centers of growth, not granted autonomy to cities, not allowed the Jews to lend money or something like this. But it was also the source of immense destruction. The wars of religion are straightforwardly a consequence of the disunity of state and church in Europe. And the wars of religion, especially the 30-Year War, were completely devastating for Germany. Some estimates put the death toll at something like 20 to 30% of the population, right? there were parts of Germany that were depopulated. It needed centuries to recover. And when I, of course, say Germany, I mean broader Central Europe. Poles, Czechs, Belgians, Dutchmen, Italians, Slovenians, they all lived within the confines of this vague entity, which was called the Holy Roman Empire, which in the early medieval period is a functional kingdom, but by the end of this process of war and separation ends up becoming a legal fiction. You know, again, Voltaire can quip in the Age of Enlightenment that the Holy Roman Empire is neither Roman nor holy nor empire, but a few centuries earlier that would have been false, right? There are many times when the Holy Roman Empire beat the much more centralized kingdom of France, or say halted the advance of Ottoman armies successfully. When it did that, it might not have been Roman, it might not have been holy, but it's foolish to say it's not an empire, right? It was an empire, it ceased to be an empire. By the time of Napoleon, abolishing it is a formality. So this brings me to how a decentralized, expanding empire that might be the seat of so much innovation, right? Think about it. The printing press, the Dutch Republic, the Swiss Confederacy, the Italian city-states in the Renaissance, the Hansa, all of these happen within the confines of what's known as the Holy Roman Empire. There's perhaps never been as dynamic a laboratory of social and political and cultural and technological innovation. Or rather, it was one of the golden ages of such innovation, many of them. That functional model that led to massive demographic expansion, massive innovation in social technology, also leads to this turning point of a completely self-destructive set of wars, right? And leads then to the problems of a decentralized declining empire. A decentralized declining empire is perhaps not necessarily as bad a set of circumstances to be in as a centralized declining empire. The centralized declining empire is like a collapsing star that has run out of fuel, becoming ever denser, ever smaller, until it sort of becomes a black hole and then eventually evaporates and vanishes, right? The cannibalism sort of results in this like slowly shrinking zone of devastation. Meanwhile, a decentralized declining empire might just see a break in coordination and splitting off of new functional societies or centers. So if you're living in that circumstance and the Roman Empire collapses and you're now ruled by Vandals or Langobards in North Africa, or Arabs in Egypt, your life might improve. Your taxes might go down, you might have more safety, your education might even improve, right? So decentralized declining empires, I think, leave more of a legacy than centralized declining empires. However, they're also the sites of the most destructive wars in human history. I think almost every truly devastating war for the population has happened in a sort of decentralized declining empire context. And I can give some examples. There are the Roman civil wars, but also from Chinese history, I think the Three Kingdoms period, which is much romanticized in Chinese classical literature, is actually a period of intense warfare and destruction. Most population estimates suggest that the population after this period is about 70 million people fewer than before this period, right? So when you have the golden age of the Han Dynasty, followed by a split into these three evenly matched kingdoms, and then centuries of warfare and decay, population decline is a hard to fake sign that things have in fact gotten worse. So, I'm perhaps too partial to physics analogies, but I've sort of now talked through the model of expansion and decline based on whether the center or the middle is producing resources. If the periphery is producing resources, then you're actually in a lot of trouble. Your zone of coordination, your coherent civilization is very likely to split up into several. It's very unlikely to stay together. So talking through this 2x2 model, we might wonder now about the deeper causes of institutional decay. If either the center or the middle never lost relevant social technologies or never lost the ability to innovate in social technologies, we should basically still see the linear progressive history that we described earlier, right? You should see a ratchet of human progress, but I think you don't. So this is when I introduced the analogy of intellectual dark matter, right? What is dark matter? Dark matter is a physics hypothesis where, after observing the rotation of the galaxies, it is noted that if you count all the stars, add up their mass, all the identifiable sources of mass you can find, most of the mass that's needed for the gravitational force to keep these spinning galaxies from spinning apart is still missing. This is called dark matter, dark in the sense that it's not observed. Perhaps in the near future, physicists will discover that they were in fact wrong, and in fact gravity just works a little bit different, and there's no missing mass. Or they might discover some exotic particles that explain the missing mass. It doesn't really matter for our metaphor, because intellectual dark matter is like physical dark matter. Knowledge, skills, and practices we can prove or infer exist even if we don't know what they are. So even without directly observing them, we know something must be in that space. The easiest to talk about is sort of the intellectual dark matter where we have references to texts that we no longer have. Here is the oldest surviving copy of Aristotle's The Constitution of Athens that I mentioned earlier. This is from 100 AD. We have, many texts from antiquity, and one way to talk about how much intellectual matter existed in the past that we have no access to, that is like both the data set of history and theory, but also on things such as biology. One of the most interesting passages I ever ran into was a version of germ theory discussed casually by a Roman Roman sort of science popularizer, right? If you go read Pliny, Polybius, and all of these people, they're often summarizing Greek sources and translating them for a Latin-speaking audience that's not as educated in science. We're near the pause. Okay, just let me 2 minutes and then we'll do the 10-minute break, okay? Sorry about this, I'm still running behind a little bit. I'm gonna cut that anecdote short and maybe send it in a follow-up email. There is the introduction of germ theory that's just casually mentioned by a Roman writer who's referring to, if you inherit a farm in a marshy area, you should sell that farm immediately because in the marshes, live mosquitoes. And within mosquitoes, there are these tiny creatures too small to see that when the mosquito stings you, they go into your blood and cause you to be sick. That's like thousands of years before germ theory, and it's in fact an accurate description of mosquitoes. And who is this Greek author that this uneducated Roman is reading? Well, we know the author he's reading, but we don't have that author's work. And were that work preserved, maybe when you went on Wikipedia and read about the germ theory of disease, this author and his book would have been listed, not the later one. So I'll just leave you before the break with this little statistic. This is an obsolete estimate. It's probably, I think we've not discovered that many new texts, but we've discovered more references to even more Greek authors. But from 1948, there's an estimate that we only have the incomplete works of 13% of the 2,000 known ancient Greek authors. So that means that 87% of them we only know by reference or name. We have no preserved fragments. And when it comes to completed works, it's even worse. We only have a complete work for 6.8% of ancient Greek authors. All of those people, those preserved texts like Aristotle's texts or Plato's texts or whatever, these are in dialogue with long lost works.